Hey, this is Matthew, and welcome back to Nerd News Today, and this is how my hair looks after 3 months of being in quarantine. I wanted to come at you guys today with a hot take from something in the news that I decided I had a little bit of an opinion on, and thought it might be useful to share some of my knowledge and information with you guys to help maybe make your decisions, or at least change your thought process a little bit. So HBO is in the news now because they've announced that they're pulling from their HBO MAX streaming service Gone with the Wind temporarily. And this is causing quite the ruckus with many people, of course. All sorts of people are decrying this as censorship and saying all sorts of other things about it, and I want to do my best to set the record straight and give my thoughts on the situation here. So the story actually begins not with HBO, but with an op-ed written by John Ridley in the LA Times. Ridley, you may know, is the writer of the Academy Award-winning 12 Years a Slave, and he did a piece just very recently as well, discussing Gone with the Wind, and basically saying how this movie should kind of be maybe put away for a little bit, and specifically pointed that to HBO since they were announcing it as a big part of their HBO MAX service. And in this piece, what John Ridley is suggesting is that temporarily HBO MAX not include Gone with the Wind as part of their streaming service due to the sensitive nature and ultimately the poor stereotypes that the film does portray in it. Well, HBO heard him, as well as I'm sure many other fans who wrote in to show their support for that idea, and HBO has decided that for the time being, temporarily, HBO Max will not include Gone with the Wind. When it will return to HBO Max, it will come with some kind of a disclaimer or some other sort of conversation starter to essentially help put the film into context and explain that this is a movie from 1939 and certainly does not reflect how things are today, nor did it necessarily reflect how realistic times were when the film took place. Now, I'm in a lot of classic movie groups on Facebook, and I've seen other people complain about this elsewhere, and there's a lot of arguments that people are saying about the film and how it's being treated at this time, so I want to give my thoughts on all this craziness here. So the first thing, of course, I'm seeing is that everybody is saying that this is censorship and HBO is giving to those gosh darn libs. Well, really, this is not censorship. This is putting historical context into a film that is extremely outdated, and even at the time, showed outdated things about a certain type of person, in this case, people of color. The film takes place during the 1800s. Times were quite different then, and slaves were still part of society. And it's really about Hattie McDaniel's portrayal of Mammy, which is a horrible name, and I don't really want to say that name again for the rest of this video, so I'm going to do my best not to. But ultimately, it is about Hattie McDaniel's character, who is a slave and a servant to our main characters in the film. So this particular character is, of course, a pretty big stereotype. And it makes sense that with everything that's happening right now in the world, especially in this country, that this is not something we want to be highlighting right now. Is it censorship? Well, no, because as people have said, it's being taken down temporarily and it will return to the service with some kind of a disclaimer. Really, where this whole censorship argument comes from is I'm seeing a lot of folks who are reading really horrible headlines from various places that aren't really giving you the full story. And I'm seeing a lot of older folks in particular who are reading and reacting to the headline without, of course, clicking the link. Boomers. There's not much you can do about that except, again, here, try to educate those folks. And that's what I've been trying to do here and there, is let people know that it is a temporary measure. The film is not being written out of history or erased from history. In fact, in that op-ed, Ridley even writes that he does not want the film to disappear from the annals of time forever. It's just a temporary measure, just for the time being, purely out of sensitivity to all the things happening right now in this country. The people that are out there saying censorship, again, it's not something that's being censored, because when the movie does come back, it will be presented in its complete, full capacity. Nothing is going to be cut from it. They're going to just put some kind of a disclaimer at the front, which really there's nothing wrong with that. Censorship would be if they took Gone with the Wind and cut out every section that had Hattie McDaniel's character in it. That is censorship. Censorship would be taking that movie and, in fact, scrubbing it from history by saying it never happened and making it completely disappear, which we know cannot happen. I've seen some people even make comments and allusions to Nazi Germany and how they would censor books or burn books and that kind of thing. This is absolutely 110% not that situation whatsoever. Again, it's temporary, and that's the key word that a lot of folks seem to be missing. Boomers. Now, at the time that Gone with the Wind came out, Hattie McDaniel was actually kind of towards the tail end of her film career. She would pass away, I think, in 1952 or something like that. But in 1939, she won the Academy Award for Supporting Actress in Gone with the Wind. That was the first time a black person had won that role. And just to add a little bit more of interesting context, the next black person to win that category would have been Whoopi Goldberg in 1990 for Ghost. So that's over 50 years later. And I'm not saying that there weren't other people of color who were nominated for that award, but the next person to win it was Whoopi, and that's many decades after Hattie had won her award at the 12th Oscars. Now, Hattie McDaniel herself is a pretty interesting person in that she really kind of did play a lot of stereotypical roles throughout her career. And a lot of people have said, oh, well, she was fine with it. And there's a quote that's been put around a lot saying she'd rather play a slave than be a slave. And that quote has kind of been bastardized a little bit because the full quote is actually more about money. It's more about financials, in fact. And more so, the quote was that she'd rather be making $700 a week playing a slave versus being paid $7 to be a slave. So essentially, it comes down to money. And I think that's part of where a lot of the controversy about her comes within the black community. Because even in 1939, she was criticized by the NAACP and other organizations for her portrayal of these stereotypical characters. Hattie herself was more or less apolitical throughout her lifetime. She really tried to keep her nose completely out of politics. Ultimately, she did what she thought was best for herself, for her family, and those are the choices that she made. Were these portrayals ultimately positive or good in any way? Well, at the end of the day, you can say that it was groundbreaking and pioneering, the fact that she was acting and getting roles and at least getting the ground wet for the next group of actors to come in and start continuing to pioneer, forge ahead, getting more black people in films. But, again, looking back on it now in the year 2020, and you don't need to even go that far back to look at it, it does not age well in any way whatsoever. And on that same note, we should also add that back when Gone with the Wind came out, it also took criticism not just from groups like the NAACP for her portrayal of the character as being a submissive slave, but it also took criticism from folks who didn't think she was submissive enough. There was actually a pretty good backlash of people saying that it wasn't realistic enough, and the things that she was talking to, Miss Scarlet, were way, way, way incorrect, way inaccurate. She would have actually been even more submissive and more docile, and she would never have talked out of turn, if you will. And so, again, this is 1939, people criticizing the portrayal for her not being in the background far enough. How crazy is that? So another criticism I'm seeing is people are saying this is going to lead us down the slippery slope of more censorship. Being that, are you going to have to take every single film catalog ever and put all these disclaimers on it? And the answer is maybe. I can't really answer that question for you guys. But at the end of the day, if you really look at film history in America in particular, you're going to see a lot of these really bad portrayals of characters. And, things have gotten better. Still not perfect, but things have gotten better. But if we're going to, let's say, talk about things that should maybe get some kind of a disclaimer, things that really don't age well, yeah, there's plenty of movies. And I'm going to actually not even talk much about blackface in particular, because blackface is a whole other big, big topic that I don't want to spend all day on, because we could easily do that. But again, a great example would be Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, the very first talkie picture ever made, where, again, you've got a white guy wearing blackface singing a song called Mammy. And yeah, is it a good movie? Artistically speaking, yes, but the subject matter does not age well. That's a problem. It needs to be looked at through a historical, contextual lens. But again, I don't want to focus on blackface here. I'm actually going to pivot and talk about Asian representation for this particular segment here. And in particular, I want to talk about films like, let's say, The Seven Faces of Dr. Lau, the Charlie Chan series, Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. There is a big history of white actors playing Asian characters and basically playing them with pulled back eyelids and saying their R's as L's and horrible things like that. And those do not age well. There's a lot of really great movies that have that problem. So yes, contextually speaking, I don't think it's such a bad thing for us to put disclaimers on all these movies and contextualize them. And part of my logic for that is, again, future generations are going to look at this and not know what the big deal was about these movies either, because of how horribly out of date a lot of those elements are. I've got a friend now who just started watching Star Trek. She's about my age, and she's never watched a single Star Trek in her life. And so she is starting with literally Star Trek from the 60s. That's a rough place to start if you don't know anything about the series, but she wanted to start from the very top. And she began with the pilot, which has got Jeffrey Hunter in it before William Shatner came on as Kirk. And so one of the lines that Captain Pike says early on when he's talking to Majel Barrett's character, number 1, is that he's not used to seeing women on the bridge. And she immediately texted me and she was like, I thought you said the show was progressive. And I was like, well, the show was progressive for the 1960s. And then I gave her a little bit more context saying how Gene Roddenberry fought to have women on the bridge because the studio didn't want that. Talked to her more about the history of Lucille Ball being involved in the show. And again, just putting history around the show because context is king. And with context, you could see, okay, the show is not progressive for 2020, but in the 1960s, that's actually a pretty huge deal. So you might come back to me now as well and say, well, what about stereotypes of white people? How come you're only focusing on stereotypes of people of color or Asians or other folks that are not white? And usually when people come up with that argument, they'll say things like typically Italian stereotypes in mafia movies. Well, yeah, we could talk about that entirely. That's probably a whole other video, in fact, and I could do a whole takedown of Martin Scorsese if you guys want. Leave a comment below. But in particular, with these mafia stereotypes that we're seeing, the difference between those stereotypes versus Hattie McDaniel's is that these are white characters being played by white actors, and you've got a history of black and Asian characters and other races. I could even talk about Indians with Ben Kingsley doing his Gandhi, being played by white actors. wearing makeup or whatever. Or again, if there are characters who are played by people of their actual ethnicity or something within the range of it. In this case, it's that they're written to be stereotypes. And those are characters that are typically written by white people, white directors, white writers. With a mafia stereotype, it's still a white person playing a white character. And again, looking at cinematic history in America, there's plenty of cases where you've got an Asian character played by a white person, Indian people played by white people. And then the times where you have people who are of similar or correct ethnicities to be playing those parts, they are playing super duper watered down stereotypes. And that's again why I'm really stressing the point of context is king. And that's why I do agree with HBO Max temporarily pulling Gone with the Wind to put that disclaimer up. And another thing I could add to that argument as well is I'm a big fan of TCM, Turner Classic Movies. And they've shown Gone with the Wind, geez, I think they've already probably shown at least once or twice this year already. And it's constantly shown on that channel. But when they show Gone with the Wind, or again, Jazz Singer, other movies where, let's say, characters are in blackface or portraying really bad racial stereotypes, usually the host, whoever it's going to be that night, does give some kind of a disclaimer, basically telling you, yeah, here's what you're going to see. It was a product of the times. Was it good? No, unfortunately, that's just what it was at the time. And that ultimately is the lens we have to look at it with. There will be people on the other hand as well saying, well, there's way worse movies, why aren't they removing those? Or putting up disclaimers with those. Yeah, there totally are way worse movies, but Gone with the Wind is considered one of the best, if not the best, pictures of all time. It's got a lot of eyes on it. There's a lot of nostalgia attached to it as well, with especially older people. But once again, younger folks coming into this movie expecting a certain thing, they're gonna have no idea what to expect. It's not a great portrayal. You know, I've watched some classic movies sometimes with, let's say, an Asian person, in fact, who've watched some of those films that I mentioned, and they didn't know it was coming. They didn't know that Mickey Rooney was going to suddenly saunter down in a kimono doing a really terrible impersonation of what he thinks a Japanese person sounds like. And I get to watch my friends sit there awkwardly, quietly, not knowing what to say or how to react. So these are the kind of things that we're trying to avoid nowadays. Now then you're going to get the real wacko folks out there who are going to say, well, that's too bad. Why don't they just make their own movies if they don't like that? Similar things of that nature. And the answer is, well, yes, those people of color, have made their own films. The difference is you probably just don't know what the heck they are. In fact, I will ask anybody out there right now to name a James Earl Jones movie besides Lion King, Coming to America, or Star Wars. There's plenty out there that he was a lead in. He even was nominated for some Academy Awards. So yeah, there's plenty of pictures there with many leading actors, Sidney Poitier, James Earl Jones, and many you probably haven't even heard of or as familiar with, who have done some pretty amazing work. Actors, directors, writers. It's just that you probably didn't know about these movies because it wasn't targeted for you. Gone with the Wind is a very mainstream, very well-known picture. Again, one of the most favorite films of all time by many film critics and many film lovers. But there's also plenty of movies out there by people of color that you probably have no idea about. And I'm actually going to recommend you guys check out the Criterion channel because right now on their streaming service, they've actually removed the paywall for certain films that were directed, written by, or are about people of color. And that's to raise awareness of the fact that yes, there is a whole other genre of film, a whole other product out there that most folks like myself probably don't even know about because we weren't exposed to it. And it's really eye-opening for you guys to see this kind of stuff because it's a whole new world, it's a whole different world for many people who aren't exposed to this kind of stuff. So, I really recommend that if that's your argument, yeah, go do your research, do your due diligence, and come back to me. So at the end of the day, these are my kind of scrambled thoughts about HBO taking down Gone with the Wind temporarily. And that's really the main point I want to say is, again, it is temporarily, and that it needs to be looked at through a historical, contextual lens. Films mean nothing without context. There's plenty of movies that you could watch that were considered amazing back in the day and don't age well because contextually they don't make sense to us anymore. Some movies like, let's say, Network do still hold up, but even now I feel like a movie like Network is starting to quickly lose a lot of its power and its impact because TV is not what it used to be. Streaming is now the big thing. So I guarantee you guys in 30, 40 years, people who've never seen Network, and by then I'm sure streaming devices will be even bigger than they are right now, we're gonna have a lot of younger folks looking at Network and saying, what's the big deal? So one more time for everybody out there in the back in case you didn't hear me, context is king. Now I of course would love to hear what you have to say about this topic. It's a pretty hot take I've got here, but I'm sure there's gonna be some folks out there who agree and some that disagree with me. So go ahead, leave your comments. I may or may not respond depending how they are, depending on my mood. I don't normally like to respond to comments in general, but I feel like this is a good conversation to have, and I will not be removing any comments unless they are super disrespectful and insulting. So please, let's have an actual discussion, because without discussion, we can't share ideas, share thoughts, and really come to some kind of actual conclusion about this idea. At the end of the day, there's always going to be discourse about any kind of hot topic out there, but I think this is a good one to really kind of start with, test the waters, and really think about it with a rational head. So that's my thoughts on HBO Max taking away Gone with the Wind temporarily, keyword temporarily. I think it's for pretty good reason, pretty valid reason, and I wouldn't be surprised if more films like that would follow in suit and put some kind of disclaimer in the front of them, because there's a lot of pretty problematic movies from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and, things can go on. As the world changes and as people evolve, our thoughts will change, and all these things are going to evolve with us. So we're different people than we were back in the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s, and the people in the year 2060 are going to have just completely different thoughts as well. So the only way for us to keep up with the times and make sure that these films really don't get lost to the annals of history is to update our thought processes on them while it's happening. So until next time, I'm Matthew from Nerd News Today. Thanks for sitting through this kind of odd rant. There might be more of these nowadays. We'll see. I got some more thoughts on stuff. I hope you enjoyed hearing them, and I hope you've got some things to say about it as well. So until next time, be safe out there. We'll see you guys later.